The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Thompson Restoration Studio in Charlottesville, Virginia, casting long rectangles of amber across the worn wooden floors. Maya Thompson stood at her workstation, her fingers hovering over the keyboard of her specialized imaging computer, the same position she had occupied for nearly 16 years. At 38 years old, she had established herself as one of the most sought-after photo restoration specialists on the East Coast, her reputation built on an almost supernatural ability to resurrect images that others had declared beyond saving. The walls around her were covered with before and after examples of her work, ghostly faces transformed into sharp, recognizable portraits, faded landscapes restored to vibrant clarity, damaged wedding photos given new life. The studio occupied the ground floor of a converted farmhouse that had belonged to her family for 6 generations, the property encompassing 12 acres of rolling Virginia countryside that had appreciated in value to several $1,000,000 over the decades. On this particular Tuesday morning, Maya was expecting a new client, a man named Charles Whitmore who had called the previous week with what he described as an unusual request. He arrived precisely at 9, driving a silver Mercedes SUV up the gravel driveway and parking beside the ancient oak tree that had stood on the property for over 200 years. Charles Whitmore was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair combed neatly back and an air of old money that Maya recognized immediately, the kind of understated wealth that came from generations of accumulated privilege. He carried a leather portfolio case with the care of someone transporting something irreplaceable, and Maya noted the way his hands trembled slightly as he unzipped it and withdrew a protective sleeve. Inside the sleeve was a daguerreotype, one of the earliest forms of photography, popular in America from the 1840s through the 1860s. Maya had worked with daguerreotypes before, but this one was exceptional, both in its size and its apparent condition. The silver-coated copper plate measured approximately 8 by 10 inches, considerably larger than most surviving examples, and despite some surface oxidation, the image remained remarkably intact. Charles explained that the photograph had been discovered in the attic of his family's estate in Orange County, found inside a locked wooden box that his late mother had kept hidden for decades. He wanted Maya to restore and enlarge the image, to bring out details that were difficult to see with the naked eye, and to create archival-quality reproductions that could be shared with various members of his extended family. Maya examined the daguerreotype under her magnifying lamp, tilting it to catch the light at different angles, watching as the image appeared and disappeared with the shifting illumination. This was one of the peculiar characteristics of daguerreotypes. They were essentially mirrors with images trapped inside them, viewable only at certain angles. The photograph depicted what appeared to be a prosperous farmhouse surrounded by outbuildings, with several figures standing in the foreground. The level of detail was extraordinary for the period, suggesting that the photographer had used top-quality equipment and had possessed considerable skill. Maya quoted her price for the restoration work, and Charles agreed without negotiation, leaving the daguerreotype in her care with instructions to call him when the work was complete. For the next 3 days, Maya devoted herself to the project with increasing fascination. She began by photographing the daguerreotype using a specialized camera system designed for capturing reflective surfaces, taking hundreds of images at different angles and lighting conditions. These photographs were then combined using sophisticated software that could extract details from multiple exposures, building a composite image that revealed far more than the eye could see unaided. As the enhanced image began to materialize on her screen, Maya felt a strange sensation creeping over her, a feeling of recognition that she could not immediately explain. The farmhouse in the photograph looked familiar, deeply familiar, in a way that went beyond simple architectural style. She enlarged a section showing the house more clearly and felt her breath catch in her throat. The roofline was distinctive, with a particular arrangement of dormers and chimneys that Maya knew by heart because she saw it every day. The oak tree in the foreground, though smaller, had the same characteristic split in its trunk that the ancient tree outside her window displayed. The stone wall running along what would have been the property line matched the tumbled remains of the wall that still bordered her land. Maya enlarged the image further, her hands trembling now like Charles Whitmore's had trembled when he handed over the portfolio. She was looking at her own property as it had appeared in 1860, 5 years before the end of the Civil War, captured in silver and light 164 years ago. The realization was disorienting, vertiginous, as if time had folded in on itself and she was looking through a window into the past. Maya pushed back from her workstation and walked outside, needing to feel the physical reality of the present moment. She stood beneath the oak tree and looked at her studio, then returned inside and looked at the photograph on her screen. There was no question. This was the same place. But her family had owned this land since 1855, 5 years before this photograph was taken. That meant Charles Whitmore's ancestors had been here, on her family's property, standing where she now stood. Why would someone from another family have commissioned such an elaborate photograph of property they did not own? Unless, Maya thought with growing unease, unless her understanding of the property's history was incomplete, she returned to her workstation and continued enhancing the image, now driven by more than professional interest. She isolated the figures standing in front of the farmhouse and enlarged them individually. There were 4 white men in formal attire, their faces stern and composed in the manner typical of 19th century photography. 2 black individuals stood to the side, a man and a woman, their postures different from the white figures, somehow both present and marginalized in the same frame. Maya felt a chill run through her as she looked at their faces. The woman's eyes in particular seemed to hold an expression of profound sorrow that transcended the century and a half between them. She enlarged the background of the image, searching for additional details, and that was when she noticed something that changed everything. On a table visible through one of the farmhouse windows, partially obscured by a curtain, there appeared to be a document. Maya enhanced this section of the image repeatedly, pushing her software to its limits, extracting detail from the silver molecules of the original daguerreotype. Slowly, agonizingly, text began to emerge from the shadow and blur. It was a legal document of some kind, and though she could not read all of it, certain words became clear enough to decipher. She saw the word exchange, and she saw the word property, and then, with a sensation of horror that seemed to grip her entire body, she saw the word slaves, followed by what appeared to be a number. The number was 3. Maya sat motionless in front of her screen, unable to process what she was seeing. The document appeared to be an agreement for the exchange of property, human property, for the land she was sitting on. 3 people had been traded like livestock so that someone could own this farmhouse, this 12 acres, this ground beneath her feet. She thought about her grandmother, who had raised her in this house, who had spoken with such pride about the family's deep roots in Virginia, about the Thompson legacy of land ownership that stretched back before the Civil War. Her grandmother had never mentioned anything about slavery, had never suggested that the family's prosperity might have been built on such a foundation. Either she had not known, or she had chosen to bury that knowledge so deep that it disappeared from family memory. The afternoon passed without Maya noticing. She sat at her workstation as the light changed from morning gold to afternoon white to evening amber, unable to tear her eyes from the image, unable to reconcile what she was discovering with everything she thought she knew about her family and her home. She thought about the pride she had felt in this property, the sense of continuity and belonging, the plans she had made to pass it on to her own children someday. All of that pride now felt contaminated, built on a lie of omission that had been maintained for more than a century and a half. And yet the land was still beautiful in the fading light, the oak trees still magnificent, the house still solid and welcoming. The evil that had been done here did not change those facts, but it changed what those facts meant. That night, Maya could not sleep. She lay in the same bedroom where her grandmother had slept, where generations of Thompsons had slept before her, and she thought about the 3 people who had been traded for this privilege. She thought about their names, which she did not know, about their families, about what had happened to them after they were separated from this land that had been exchanged for their lives. She thought about the woman in the photograph, the sorrow in her eyes, and she wondered if she had been one of the 3. She wondered where they had been taken, whether they had survived the war that would come 5 years after the photograph was taken, whether they had found freedom, whether they had descendants living somewhere today who knew nothing about this transaction that had shaped their ancestors' fate. Around 3 in the morning, Maya got out of bed and walked through the darkened house, feeling the worn floorboards beneath her feet, seeing the familiar shadows in a new and disturbing light. She went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and sat at the table where she had eaten thousands of meals, where her grandmother had taught her to play cards, where the family had gathered for holiday celebrations going back decades. This was the same table, she realized, that would have been in this house in 1860. The same table where the transaction might have been discussed, where papers might have been signed, where white men in formal attire might have raised glasses to celebrate their profitable exchange. The ordinariness of the table made the evil feel more real, more present, more impossible to dismiss as something from a distant and different time. She thought about her own work, the profession she had devoted her adult life to mastering. She had always believed that photo restoration was a way of preserving truth, of rescuing the past from decay and loss, of allowing people to see their ancestors clearly across the distance of time. But now she wondered if her work had been, in some sense, a form of hiding. She had restored the surfaces of images without asking what lay beneath them, had made faces visible without asking whose faces had been left out of the frame entirely. She had served clients who wanted beautiful prints for their walls without ever suggesting that beauty and history did not always align. In her own home, she had accepted the beautiful story without looking for the hidden truth. The photograph that Charles Whitmore had brought her was forcing her to confront that failure, and she was not sure she was ready for what the confrontation would require. By dawn, Maya had made a decision. She would find out what had happened. She would learn their names. She would trace whatever records existed and discover what had become of the people who had been traded for her family's land. She did not know what she would do with that knowledge once she possessed it, did not know whether finding the truth would bring clarity or only deeper confusion. But she knew that she could not live on this property, could not continue her work of restoration, could not look at that photograph on her screen without knowing who those people were and what had been done to them. She owed them at least that much. She owed them the dignity of being known. The Virginia Historical Society occupied a stately building on the boulevard in Richmond, a city that had served as the capital of the Confederacy and still carried that history in its bones. Maya arrived on a Thursday morning, having spent the previous day gathering documents from her own family archives, papers that her grandmother had kept in a fireproof safe that Maya had never had reason to open before. She had found the deed to the property dated 1855, exactly as family lore had always claimed, but the deed raised more questions than it answered. The purchase price was listed as $1, which was a common legal fiction used when property changed hands through means other than straightforward sale. The previous owner was listed as one Frederick Beaumont of Orange County, the same county where Charles Whitmore's family had their estate. The research librarian at the Historical Society was a man in his 50s named Howard Patterson, and he had spent his entire career helping people navigate the often disturbing records of Virginia's past. When Maya explained what she was looking for, he nodded slowly, his expression revealing neither surprise nor judgment. He had heard similar stories many times before, had helped many Virginians confront the reality that their family's wealth and property had origins in slavery. He led Maya to a section of the archives devoted to county records and explained how the documentation worked. Slave sales and exchanges were recorded in various ways depending on the period and the county, sometimes in dedicated slave schedules, sometimes in general property records, sometimes in private papers that had found their way into historical collections decades or centuries later. Maya spent the next 6 hours immersed in records from Albemarle County, where her property was located, and Orange County, where the Beaumont and Whitmore families had been prominent. The work was slow and often heartbreaking, requiring her to read through hundreds of entries that documented the buying and selling of human beings with the same matter-of-fact language used for livestock and furniture. Each entry represented a life reduced to a name, an age, a physical description, a dollar amount. Maya found herself pausing over these entries, trying to imagine the people behind the brutal shorthand, the families torn apart, the children sold away from parents, the husbands and wives separated forever. She found her own family name appearing multiple times in these records, each appearance another stone on the scale weighing against the mythology she had been raised with. Late in the afternoon, she found what she was looking for. The document was filed in a collection of papers from the Beaumont family that had been donated to the Historical Society in 1952. It was an agreement dated March 15, 1855, between Frederick Beaumont and William Thompson, whom Maya knew to be her great-great-great-grandfather. The agreement detailed the exchange of 12 acres of land in Albemarle County, along with all structures and improvements thereon, in return for 3 enslaved persons currently held by William Thompson on his property in Fluvanna County. The 3 persons were named in the document. Samuel, aged approximately 32 years, described as a skilled carpenter and blacksmith. Patience, aged approximately 28 years, described as a domestic servant and seamstress. Grace, aged approximately 6 years, described as the daughter of Samuel and Patience. Maya read the names over and over, her vision blurring with tears she did not try to stop. Samuel, Patience, and Grace. A family, a complete family unit with a father and mother and child, traded away for 12 acres and a farmhouse. She thought about Grace especially, about a 6-year-old girl torn from the only home she had known, taken to a new place where she would grow up in bondage, her childhood defined by labor and subjugation. She thought about the photograph, about the woman with the sorrowful eyes, and she wondered if that woman had been Patience, if Maya had been looking at the face of someone who knew she was about to lose everything. She asked Howard Patterson if there was any way to find out what had happened to Samuel, Patience, and Grace after they were transferred to Frederick Beaumont. Howard led her to a different section of the archives, where records from the years after the Civil War were kept. These records were different in character from the antebellum documents, reflecting the chaos and transformation of Reconstruction. There were Freedmen's Bureau records documenting the Bureau's efforts to help formerly enslaved people find lost family members, register marriages that had never been legal under slavery, establish schools, and negotiate labor contracts. There were applications for military pensions from black soldiers who had served in the Union Army and their widows. There were church records from congregations that had formed as soon as black Virginians gained the freedom to worship as they chose. These records, Howard explained, were where the story might continue, where Samuel and Patience and Grace might reappear as free people trying to build lives from the wreckage slavery had made. It took another 2 days of searching, but Maya eventually found traces of all 3. Samuel appeared in Freedmen's Bureau records from 1866, when he registered a labor contract with a farm in Madison County, approximately 40 miles from the Beaumont property. The record noted that he was seeking information about his wife and daughter, from whom he had been separated during the war. Maya felt her heart crack at those words, imagining Samuel's desperation, his hope that somehow his family had survived and that they could be reunited now that freedom had come. Patience appeared in a different set of records, a pension application filed in 1892 by the widow of a Union Army soldier named James Washington, who had served with the United States colored troops. The application included testimony from Patience Washington, formerly Patience Beaumont, describing her years of enslavement and stating that she had lost contact with her first husband during the war. Grace was harder to trace, but Maya found her in the records of a freedmen's school in Louisa County, where a Grace Beaumont was listed among the students in 1867. The school records included notes from teachers, and there was an entry describing Grace as an exceptionally bright student who had learned to read within months of enrollment and who hoped to become a teacher herself someday. Maya photocopied all of these records, her hands shaking with a combination of grief and something that might have been gratitude. These 3 people, whose lives had been traded for her family's land, had survived. They had lost each other, that was clear from the records, but they had survived the war and they had walked into freedom and they had built new lives for themselves. Grace had gone to school. Samuel had worked as a free man. Patience had married again and had filed for a pension, which meant she must have been alive into her 60s at least. The more Maya learned about their survival, the more she felt the weight of what had been taken from them. Samuel and Patience had been married, or had at least formed a family unit that slavery did not legally recognize but that was real to them. They had a daughter they loved, a child they must have hoped would grow up knowing her parents, knowing where she came from, knowing that she was cherished. And then one day, because of a decision made by white men on pieces of paper, that family was destroyed. They were loaded onto a wagon or made to walk, were taken 40 miles to a new place where they knew no one, where they would serve a new master under whatever conditions he chose to impose. Their daughter, 6 years old, would have cried for her father. Their hearts would have been broken in ways that never fully healed. Maya drove back to Charlottesville that night, the photocopies on the seat beside her like passengers from the past. She thought about calling her mother, who lived in a retirement community in Fredericksburg, but she was not yet ready for that conversation. Her mother, like her grandmother before her, had always spoken of the Thompson family with uncomplicated pride, emphasizing the land and the longevity and the deep Virginia roots. Would her mother already know the truth and have chosen to hide it? Would she be shocked and horrified? Would she deny it, dismiss it, insist that things were different back then and that there was no use dwelling on the past? Maya realized that she could not predict her mother's reaction, which perhaps said something about the careful silences that had been maintained within their family, the topics that were implicitly understood to be off-limits. That night, Maya began the work that would consume the next 3 months of her life. She started building a genealogical tree for Samuel, Patience, and Grace, using the records she had found as a starting point and branching out from there. She subscribed to multiple genealogy databases, spent hours on ancestry forums, hired a professional genealogist who specialized in African American family research. The work was painstaking and often frustrating, full of dead ends and contradictions and records that did not survive the decades of neglect. But slowly, piece by piece, she began to reconstruct the family's story. Grace had indeed become a teacher, working in rural schools in Central Virginia for over 30 years. She had married a man named Thomas Davis and had 4 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. Samuel had never found his wife and daughter. He had died in 1881 in Madison County, still searching, still hoping, still listed in census records as living alone. Patience had made a new life with James Washington, had borne 2 more children, had been widowed in 1884 and had lived until 1907, dying at the age of approximately 80 in a house in Richmond that she owned outright. Maya traced the descendants of Grace and the descendants of Patience through the 20th century, through the Great Migration and the Civil Rights Movement, and into the present day. The family had scattered across the country, some moving north to Philadelphia and New York, some moving west to Chicago and Los Angeles, some remaining in Virginia. She found doctors and lawyers and teachers among the descendants, soldiers and ministers and business owners, a whole constellation of lives that had grown from the survival of Samuel and Patience and Grace. One descendant caught Maya's attention more than the others. Her name was Celeste Davis, and she lived in Richmond, just an hour away from Charlottesville. She was 61 years old, a retired professor of history at Virginia State University, the great-great-granddaughter of Grace. Maya stared at Celeste's photograph on the university website, looking for some resemblance to the faces in the 1860 daguerreotype, some echo of that sorrow she had seen in the woman's eyes. She thought about reaching out to Celeste, about telling her what she had discovered, and she was paralyzed by uncertainty. What right did she have to contact this woman and dredge up a painful history? What could she possibly say that would not sound like a request for absolution, a desire to be forgiven for sins she had not personally committed but from which she had undeniably benefited? She decided to wait, to think, to be sure she was acting from the right motives before she took a step that could not be taken back. 2 weeks after finding Celeste Davis, Maya still had not made contact. She had started writing emails a dozen times, had picked up the phone and put it down again, had driven halfway to Richmond before turning around. What stopped her each time was the knowledge that she could not control how her intrusion would be received. Celeste Davis had built a life, a successful and presumably happy life, and Maya was proposing to insert herself into that life with a story about slavery and land theft and her own family's culpability. What if Celeste already knew this history and had chosen to move past it? What if she did not know and did not want to know? What if she reacted with anger, with accusations, with demands that Maya could not meet? Each of these possibilities felt equally plausible, and Maya could not decide which she feared most. In the meantime, she decided to confront her own family. She called her mother and her 2 aunts and asked them to come to Charlottesville for a family meeting. She did not explain why, wanting to see their initial reactions when she presented the evidence. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, her mother Eleanor and her aunts Patricia and Rose, 3 sisters in their 70s who had grown up in this farmhouse and who returned to it now with the easy familiarity of people coming home. They sat in the kitchen where they had sat as children, and they looked at Maya with expectant curiosity, wondering what could be important enough to require an in-person gathering. Maya had printed out the key documents and had the enhanced photograph displayed on her laptop. She took a deep breath and began to explain what she had discovered, The room was very quiet when she finished. Her mother stared at the documents without touching them, her face pale and set. Her Aunt Patricia had tears running down her cheeks. Her Aunt Rose was shaking her head slowly, repeatedly, as if trying to deny the reality of what she had heard. Maya waited for someone to speak, watching the three women process information that overturned everything they thought they knew about their family's past. It was her mother who broke the silence, and her words were not what Maya had expected. Eleanor said that her own mother, Maya's grandmother, had known. She had found documents in the safe decades ago, had read them, and had decided to bury them again rather than burden her children with knowledge she thought would only cause pain. Maya felt a rush of anger that surprised her with its intensity. Her grandmother had known and had said nothing, had allowed the family to continue celebrating their Virginia heritage without acknowledging what that heritage had cost other people. She had looked Maya in the eye and told her stories about the Thompson family's deep roots, about their persistence and their values and their connection to this land, and she had left out the most important part of the story. She had chosen comfort over truth, pride over accountability, and she had passed that choice down to her children and grandchildren like a genetic trait. Maya thought about all the times she had brought friends here and boasted about her family's history, about the Thanksgiving dinners and 4th of July barbecues where they had gathered on this land and felt virtuous in their continuity. All of it felt different now, tainted by the knowledge of what had been hidden. Her Aunt Rose spoke next, and her words were harder to hear. She asked what Maya intended to do with this information, her tone making clear that she hoped the answer was nothing. She argued that the past was past, that slavery had ended more than 150 years ago, that nothing could be done now to change what had happened. She said that making this public would only cause harm to the family, would invite criticism and possibly lawsuits, would destroy the reputation that generations of Thompsons had built. She looked at Maya with something like pleading in her eyes and asked whether it was really necessary to dig up pain that had been buried for so long. Patricia nodded along with her sister's words, though her expression was more conflicted, and Eleanor sat silent and still, watching Maya with an unreadable gaze. Maya listened to her aunts and felt something clarify inside her. She had been uncertain about what to do, had worried about the consequences of exposure and the possibility of making things worse. But listening to Aunt Rose argue for continued silence, she understood that silence was not a neutral position. Silence was a choice to prioritize the comfort of the beneficiaries over the dignity of the victims. Silence was what had allowed this injustice to be forgotten in the first place, had allowed the Thompson family to accumulate wealth and status while Samuel and Patience and Grace were erased from the historical record. If she remained silent now, she would be complicit in that erasure. She would be choosing her family's reputation over the truth, and she would be repeating her grandmother's mistake. She looked at her mother and her aunts, these three women who had shaped her understanding of family and history and belonging, and she saw how different their perspectives were. Aunt Rose was afraid, that much was clear, afraid of what this revelation might cost them in social standing and financial security and the comfort of a heroic family narrative. Aunt Patricia seemed torn, wanting to do what was right but unsure what that meant when right and easy pointed in different directions. And her mother sat silent and watchful, her face revealing nothing of what she was thinking but her presence suggesting that she was taking everything in, weighing it all against some internal measure that Maya could not see. These were the only three people who shared Maya's burden and her opportunity, the only people alive who could decide with her what the Thompson family would become. She told her mother and aunts that she was going to contact Celeste Davis. She was going to tell her the truth about what her family had done, and she was going to ask what, if anything, she could do to make amends. Aunt Rose stood up from the table, her face flushed with anger, and said that Maya had no right to make decisions that affected the whole family. She said that the land was not just Maya's, that it belonged to all of them, that their mother had left it to all three sisters jointly and Maya was only the one who happened to live there. Patricia tried to calm her down, but Rose was beyond calming. She pointed at Maya and said that if she did this, she would be tearing the family apart, that she would be betraying her grandmother's memory and destroying everything they had worked for. Then she walked out of the kitchen and out of the house, and a moment later they heard her car starting in the driveway. Patricia left soon after, her goodbye awkward and uncertain. Eleanor stayed. She sat in the kitchen with her daughter as the afternoon light faded, and she did not try to change Maya's mind. She said that she had spent her whole life being proud of this family and this land, and she was not sure how to feel now that she knew the truth. She said that she was not as brave as Maya, that she might have made the same choice her mother had made if she had been the one to find the documents. But she also said that she understood why Maya could not stay silent, and she would not stand in her way. She would talk to Rose and Patricia, would try to bring them around, but she could not promise anything. The sisters had always been strong-willed, and this was the kind of issue that could divide a family permanently. The next morning, Maya wrote to Celeste Davis. She spent hours crafting the email, trying to find words that were honest without being presumptuous, that acknowledged harm without claiming the right to be forgiven. She explained who she was and how she had discovered the connection between their families. She attached copies of the documents she had found, including the 1855 agreement and the Freedmen's Bureau records. She said that she was not expecting anything from Celeste, that she did not presume to ask for forgiveness or absolution, but that she felt Celeste had a right to know this history if she did not already. She offered to meet in person if Celeste was willing, and she said she would understand completely if Celeste preferred not to respond. Then she read the email one final time and pressed send before she could change her mind. 3 days passed without a response. Maya checked her email obsessively, refreshing the page every few minutes, feeling a mix of dread and anticipation each time the inbox loaded. She began to think that Celeste had chosen not to engage, that the silence was itself an answer, and she tried to make peace with that possibility. Then, on the 4th day, her phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm and measured, with a slight Virginia accent that sounded like an older generation's way of speaking. It was Celeste Davis, and she was calling to say that she had received Maya's email and that yes, she would like to meet. She suggested a coffee shop in Richmond, a neutral space where they could talk without the weight of history that would accompany a meeting at either of their homes. They agreed to meet that Saturday at 11 in the morning. Maya arrived early and chose a table in the back corner, away from the other customers. Her hands were trembling and she could not make them stop. She had tried to prepare for this conversation, had rehearsed what she might say, but she knew that preparation was useless for something like this. She was going to sit across from a woman whose ancestors had been enslaved by her ancestors, whose great-great-grandmother had been a 6-year-old child traded like property so that Maya's family could own the land she now lived on. There were no words adequate to that reality, no script that could make this conversation easy or comfortable. She would simply have to show up and be present and follow Celeste's lead. Celeste arrived exactly on time, and Maya recognized her immediately from the photograph on the university website. She was tall and elegant, dressed in a tailored gray suit that suggested she had come from or was going to another engagement. Her expression was neutral, revealing nothing of what she might be feeling, and Maya found herself grateful for that composure. They shook hands and sat down, and Celeste ordered tea while Maya ordered coffee she knew she would not drink. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, two women connected by a history of violence and dispossession, sitting in a Richmond coffee shop in the 21st century trying to find a way to acknowledge what could not be undone. Celeste spoke first. She said that she had known some of this history already. Her grandmother, Grace's daughter, had passed down stories about the family's time in slavery, about the separation and the search for lost relatives and the struggle to build a life after emancipation. But the stories had grown vague over the generations, losing detail and specificity until they became more legend than history. Celeste said she had always wondered exactly where Grace had been enslaved, had wondered about the people who had owned her and what had happened to them. She had conducted some genealogical research of her own over the years, but had never found the specific connection that Maya had now uncovered. So in one sense, Maya's email had not been a surprise. But in another sense, it had been a shock, because it replaced vague family legend with documented reality. Maya listened and nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Celeste continued, her voice still calm but with an undertone of something that might have been controlled anger. She said that what Maya had done in reaching out took courage, and she appreciated that courage. But she also wanted Maya to understand something. She wanted her to understand that for the descendants of enslaved people, this history was not a discovery. It was not a revelation that overturned their sense of identity and required them to rethink everything they had believed about their family. For them, This history was the foundation of their existence. They had always known that their ancestors were enslaved, had always lived with the knowledge that their family had been bought and sold and separated and exploited. The difference was that they had not had the luxury of forgetting. Maya felt her eyes filling with tears, and she did not try to hide them. She understood what Celeste was saying, understood it in a way she might not have understood before she started this journey. The Thompsons had been able to forget because forgetting served their interests. They had been able to transform themselves from slaveholders into respectable Virginia landowners, to wash the blood from their hands and present themselves as people of heritage and tradition. The Davis family had no such option. They carried the knowledge of slavery with them always, in their family stories and in the world's treatment of them, in the wealth they did not inherit and the opportunities they were denied. The two families had lived through the same history, but they had experienced it from opposite sides, and that difference in position had shaped everything that came after. They talked for over 2 hours. Celeste shared what her family knew about Grace, about how she had been remembered as a woman of remarkable strength and dignity who had devoted her life to education. She had founded one of the first schools for black children in Louisa County and had trained dozens of teachers who went on to open schools of their own. She had never stopped looking for her father, had placed advertisements in newspapers and contacted freedmen's organizations, but she had never found him. She died in 1923 believing that Samuel had probably died during the war, not knowing that he had survived and had spent the rest of his life looking for her and her mother. The irony of that mutual search, both of them seeking the other and neither of them succeeding, struck Maya as almost unbearably tragic. When they finally stood up to leave, Celeste asked Maya what she planned to do next. Maya said she had some ideas but that she wanted to hear Celeste's thoughts before she made any decisions. It was important to her that whatever she did was not just about making herself feel better, was not just a gesture that allowed her to claim she had done her part. She wanted to do something that actually mattered, something that honored Samuel and Patience and Grace in a way they would have wanted to be honored. Celeste looked at her for a long moment, and Maya thought she saw something shift in her expression, some wall coming down just slightly. Celeste said she would think about it and that she would like to meet again. Then she took Maya's hand and held it for a moment before walking out of the coffee shop and into the Richmond afternoon. Maya met with Celeste 4 more times over the following 2 months, each meeting longer and more substantive than the last. They developed a rapport that Maya would not have dared to hope for, a connection that grew from shared purpose rather than assumed intimacy. Celeste was cautious and measured, never allowing Maya to forget the imbalance in their positions, but she was also generous with her time and her knowledge and eventually her trust. She introduced Maya to other members of the Davis family, including her 2 brothers and her aunt, all of whom had different reactions to the contact. Some were welcoming and curious, others were suspicious and held back, and one cousin refused to meet Maya at all, saying that no good could come from reopening wounds that had taken generations to close. Together, Maya and Celeste developed a plan that tried to address the historical wrong without pretending it could be undone. The first element was documentation. Maya commissioned a professional historian to conduct a comprehensive study of the land transfer and its context, tracing the history of the Thompson and Beaumont families and the enslaved people whose labor had built their wealth. This study would be published and made freely available, ensuring that the truth would be part of the permanent historical record. It would include the names and stories of Samuel and Patience and Grace, restoring to them the humanity that the 1855 agreement had denied. The historian would also trace what happened to other people enslaved by both families, a project that would take years to complete but that felt essential to Celeste and her brothers. The second element was education. Maya established a scholarship fund in the names of Samuel, Patience, and Grace Thompson Davis, using the naming convention to link the 2 families across their divided history. The fund would support students from Louisa and Fluvanna and Albemarle counties who wanted to pursue degrees in education, continuing the work that Grace had devoted her life to. The initial endowment came from Maya's personal savings, but she was also launching a fundraising campaign that would allow others to contribute and that would make the fund sustainable over time. The goal was to have the fund grow large enough to support multiple full scholarships every year, a lasting legacy that would benefit students for generations to come. The third element was the hardest for Maya and the most contentious within her own family. She decided to change the deed to her property to include a historical covenant, a legal annotation that would become part of the permanent record for the land. The covenant would state that the 12 acres had been acquired in 1855 through the exchange of 3 enslaved people, and it would name them. This meant that anyone who bought or inherited the property in the future would know its history, would not be able to claim the ignorance that the Thompson family had claimed for generations. Maya's aunts were furious when she told them about this plan. They accused her of destroying the property's value, of permanently stigmatizing the family name, of making a decision that affected all of them without their consent. Rose threatened legal action, and Patricia stopped speaking to Maya entirely. Maya understood their anger even as she rejected their arguments. The property's value in dollars was not the only value that mattered, and if buyers in the future were deterred by the knowledge of how the land had been acquired, that was information they had a right to consider. She was not trying to destroy the family name but to redeem it, to demonstrate that the Thompsons of the present generation were different from the Thompsons who had traded human beings for land. And yes, she was making a decision that affected all of them, but her aunts had spent decades benefiting from a decision made by their ancestors, a decision to enslave and sell people, without any consultation either. The time for comfortable silence had passed. If her aunts could not accept that, then they would have to live with their discomfort, just as the Davis family had lived with theirs. Her mother Eleanor surprised her. After weeks of staying quiet and seemingly neutral, she called Maya one evening and said that she wanted to contribute to the scholarship fund. She said that she had been thinking about what Maya had done and why, and she had come to believe that it was the right thing. She was ashamed that she had not been brave enough to find the truth herself, ashamed that she had allowed her mother's silence to become her own. But she was proud of Maya for breaking that silence, for choosing accountability over comfort, for treating the descendants of Samuel and Patience and Grace as people who deserved to know what had happened to their ancestors. She asked if she could come to the ceremony where the scholarship would be announced, and Maya said yes, of course, she would be honored to have her there. The ceremony took place in May, on the anniversary of the date when Samuel had registered his first labor contract as a free man. It was held at the Thompson property, in a tent set up in the field beside the ancient oak tree, and it was attended by over 100 people. Celeste and her family were there, along with dozens of other descendants of Samuel and Patience and Grace who had traveled from as far as California and Michigan to be present. Historians and journalists attended, as did representatives from several universities and historical societies. Maya's mother and Aunt Patricia came, though Aunt Rose remained estranged, sending word through a lawyer that she would be exploring her legal options. Charles Whitmore came too, the man who had brought the daguerreotype to Maya for restoration, the man whose family had received Samuel and Patience and Grace in that 1855 exchange. He looked older than he had when Maya first met him, as if the weight of history had aged him, and he said nothing but shook hands with several members of the Davis family. The setting for the ceremony had been carefully chosen. The tent stood in the exact location where, according to the enhanced daguerreotype, Samuel and Patience had stood when the photograph was taken. Maya had calculated the position using the landmarks visible in the image, using the oak tree and the stone wall and the angle of the farmhouse as reference points. So when the descendants gathered to hear the speeches and to witness the announcement of the scholarship, they were standing on the same ground where their ancestors had stood, in the same relationship to the same trees and buildings, connected across time by geography and blood and the long arc of American history bending towards something that might eventually be called justice. Maya spoke at the ceremony, as did Celeste and the historian who had conducted the study. But the most moving moment came when Celeste's aunt, a woman in her 80s named Dorothy who was Grace's granddaughter, stood at the podium and addressed the crowd. She spoke about growing up with stories of slavery that were always present but never detailed, always acknowledged but never explained. She spoke about the search for lost relatives that had defined her grandmother's life, the letters written and advertisements placed and hopes raised and dashed. She spoke about what it meant to her to finally know the whole story, to have names and dates and documents that transformed legend into history. And she spoke about forgiveness, which she said was not hers to give and not Maya's to expect, because forgiveness was between each individual and God. But she could offer something else, she said. She could offer recognition that Maya had tried to do the right thing, that she had not turned away from an uncomfortable truth, that she had treated the descendants of the people her family had wronged as full human beings with a right to know their own history. After Dorothy's speech, the crowd fell silent for a long moment. Then someone began to clap, and others joined in, and soon the applause was thunderous, echoing off the farmhouse and the trees and the hills of the Virginia countryside. Maya stood at the edge of the tent with tears streaming down her face, watching the two families, Thompson and Davis, applauding together for a woman who had survived slavery and had raised children who raised children who raised children who were here today, standing on the land that had been bought with her mother's bondage, claiming it not through ownership but through memory and through presence and through an insistence on being seen. After the ceremony, Maya returned to her studio and looked at the daguerreotype that had started everything. Charles Whitmore had donated it to the Virginia Historical Society, where it would be displayed alongside the documents Maya had found, but she had made a high-quality reproduction that she kept in a place of honor on her wall. She looked at the woman in the photograph, at Patience, who she now knew had survived slavery and war and loss and had built a new life for herself in Richmond. She thought about all the things Patience could not have known when that photograph was taken, all the suffering that lay ahead of her, but also all the resilience and all the determination that would carry her through. She thought about Grace, 6 years old and soon to be separated from her father forever, who would grow up to become a teacher and would spend her life giving other children the education she had been denied. She thought about Samuel, who would search for his family until the day he died and would never know that they were searching for him too. The photograph had been her profession and her livelihood for 16 years. She had restored thousands of damaged images, had brought faces back from oblivion and made faded memories sharp again. But she understood now that restoration meant more than technical repair. It meant telling the whole truth about an image and the people in it. It meant refusing to leave anyone in the shadows, refusing to let convenience or comfort determine what was seen and what was hidden. The photograph on her wall was a restored image in both senses of the word. It was technically restored, enhanced and preserved for future generations. And it was historically restored, placed in its full context, connected to the names and stories and lives of the people it depicted. Maya stepped outside and walked across the field to the oak tree. The early summer evening was warm and soft, the kind of Virginia evening that felt timeless, that felt like it had been the same for centuries and would be the same for centuries more. She put her hand on the rough bark of the oak, feeling the same texture that Samuel and Patience might have felt, feeling her connection to the land that they had been forced to leave. She did not feel that she had atoned for what her ancestors had done. Atonement was not something she had the power to grant herself, and she was not sure it was something that could ever be fully achieved. But she felt that she had tried. She had told the truth, and she had acted on it, and she had opened a door that had been closed for more than a century and a half. The sun was setting behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows of her studio. She watched the light change and thought about what the land looked like to someone approaching it for the first time, as Samuel and Patience and Grace must have approached it in 1855, not knowing what awaited them. She thought about what it looked like to her now, layered with history she had not known before, marked by violence and loss but also by survival and resilience. The land was the same land it had always been, the same soil and trees and sky. But she saw it differently now. She saw it whole. That night, Maya began work on a new project. She was going to write a book about what she had discovered, a full account of the Thompson and Davis families and the history that connected them. She did not know if she was qualified for such a task, did not know if she had the skill to do justice to the subject. But she knew that she had to try, that the story deserved to be told completely and permanently, that it was not enough to have documents in archives and covenants in deeds. She would tell the story of Samuel the carpenter and Patience the seamstress and Grace the child who became a teacher. She would tell the story of her own family's complicity and her grandmother's silence and her aunt's resistance. She would tell the story of Celeste and Dorothy and Charles Whitmore and everyone else who had been drawn into this reckoning with the past. And she would end with the truth that she had learned through all of this, the truth that restoration was never just about the image. It was about the whole story, the painful parts and the beautiful parts, the parts that had been hidden and the parts that had always been in plain sight. In her studio, surrounded by the photographs she had spent her career restoring, Maya began to write. Outside, the ancient oak stood sentinel over the land, its branches spreading wide against the darkening sky. Somewhere in that tree's memory were Samuel and Patience and Grace, their presence absorbed into the wood and leaves and roots. Somewhere in the soil beneath Maya's feet were their footprints, their labor, their tears. They had been here, and they had been taken away, and they had survived, and they had built lives that reached across generations to touch the present. They had been forgotten, and now they were remembered. They had been erased, and now they were restored. Their names were Samuel and Patience and Grace, and their story would never be hidden again.